Sure. So my name's Deborah Turnbull, and I am a professor at the University of Adelaide. And I've been coming to Indonesia very regularly for about 10 years now. And I have got many friends and colleagues here. And today I believe I'm going to be talking about the role of psychology and climate change in extreme weather events. And I think this is such a great topic because I know these things are being experienced in Indonesia, but we're also having these extreme weather events in Australia. In the north of the country, we're experiencing more flooding, and in the south we're having more instances of very, very fierce bushfires. Yeah, so extreme weather events can have quite a profound psychological impact, because when you're feeling unsafe or under threat, you can really go into quite a significant fight or flight mode. So they can be very important at a physiological level when we become very physiologically aroused. What it means is that when we're under threat, we probably don't make decisions as clearly and as systematically as we would otherwise. So what it means is that unless we've prepared in advance, we can be really left in a situation where we're trying to figure out what to do in a very stressful and intense situation. So what we know from Australian research is that what this means is that we can make decisions that put us at extra threat. So there's good Australian evidence that indicates that when people don't plan what they're going to do ahead of time, when the event actually happens, they don't know what to do. And one of the things that really puts people at risk is that they stay in their homes and in their environments when they really don't have the resources, infrastructure and psychological preparation to do it. And so not being planned in advance can really put you at extra risk. That is a really good question. There's a few things that elevate the risk for psychological distress. There are a few individual differences that are important. We know that people who are isolated, socially, emotionally, economically, they're at added risk. We know that people who have pre-existing mental health challenges, they're at elevated risk. So I would say that they're two very important aspects of individual differences that can contribute. The other thing too is we know that the frequency, the amount of exposure. So when someone is experiencing multiple events, and that does happen. In Australia we have situations where people have been exposed to one flood. They clear up their house, they get all of their insurance in order, and then another flood happens. So that's another contributing factor to the way that people will recover and the extent to which they can be resilient. Okay, so we know that many people will be impacted. But about 5 years or so later, 3 to 5 years or so later, many people have come back to some form of equilibrium. Most people come back to some form of equilibrium. There'll be a small number of people who maintain extreme psychological distress. So how are people affected? Well, firstly, cognitively. People are unable to, make decisions in intense, threatening situations. The second thing is that people's worldviews can change. they can come to see the world in a very threatening way, where their sense of order, their sense of security is impacted. I think that psychologists, psychology practitioners and mental health practitioners have got a lot that they can do by using simple cognitive behaviour approaches to help the person to, I guess, break down their concerns and then to deal with those in a systematic way. Yeah, that's a good question, and the Australian Psychological Society have got very, I think, systematic guidelines to help not just psychologists but the general public. So firstly, I think to be aware that in advance, when an event is coming on, if you like, when you're starting to get messages about it, it's important to know or consider the fact to be mentally prepared, to stay in the place. Not just to be physically prepared, but mentally prepared. And if you're not mentally prepared, to have a plan to leave. So psychologists can, I think, help by educating the public about that. I think that they can work with communities post events to help the community to build resilience, to build social networks. They can provide mental health literacy training by explaining to people the kinds of things that help, the kinds of things that don't help. So we know that social networks are really important, but the research indicates that if your social networks are entirely with people who are going through their own grieving processes, who have also been impacted, who have left the area, who are experiencing depression, if they're the only people from whom you're getting support, then that oftentimes is not helpful. So I think how psychologists can help is by educating the public about the importance of being prepared, working with the public afterwards to redevelop community resilience, and then working with the individuals who going forward still maintain distress. And as I said, oftentimes over about 3 to 5 years or so, many people come back to a form of equilibrium, but some people don't. And I think psychology's got a role to play with those people. So the Australian Psychological Society and other organisations refer to psychological first aid. Psychological first aid. So it's about low intensity support at the outset and then only ramping it up as it's needed. So I think that the notion of resilience comes from, it's been informed in part by some branches of psychology called positive psychology, and it's about really building up the skills to bounce back from a setback. And there are many aspects to this, some of which I've alluded to, like being prepared, but also, amongst other things, practicing self-compassion, about breaking down problems, about choosing healthy social networks. So all of these things can go towards building up an individual's resilience and a community's resilience. So I think that obviously psychologists got a role to play, but not just psychologists. Obviously mental health professionals more generally have got a role to play. Family doctors and general practitioners got a role to play. In some parts of Indonesia, in some of the universities, student volunteers are working to promote mental health literacy in communities. So I think that it's about having a workforce that is well trained in these psychological first aid techniques, but it's not just the traditional mental health workforce. You also need teachers and the education sector to be aware. And there's some, for example, and some areas would argue that other professions, like engineers and architects who go back into these communities afterwards to rebuild them, for them to be trained in basic psychological first aid as well. We need an intersectoral approach, one that goes across the health sector, the housing sector, the local government sector, councils. So having an integrated, community-based, population-based approach. So it's not just one individual working with another individual, but organisations working in tandem. I think there is a role to play by community organisations and government. So in my own area, I live in a bushfire prone area, and our local community fire service that's run by volunteers, they will do basic training to community members about how to mitigate risk. How to mitigate risk in terms of keeping for example, the fuel, the leaf and the litter fuel around their house low. They can also, I think, help by giving the community basic statistics that, helps them to understand that, yes, this is a real thing. So I know that one of the events that I went to, they showed us slides that showed the increase in the temperature over the last 10 years, and you could actually see that it's not a made-up thing. There are real statistics to indicate that the temperature's on the rise. The other thing too is that governments, like our state government, plays a role in, and our Australian Broadcasting Commission play a role in doing broadcasts and information through the digital media and the traditional media, informing people that we're coming into an extreme weather event period and that they should start to prepare. I think that, like our talk today has been mainly about how psychology can contribute to responding to the psychological distress, but I think also psychology has got a big role to play in other ways. It has got a role to play in helping people to make decisions about what to consume, for example. How to lead a more sustainable lifestyle, how to make climate healthy decisions. I think it's also got a role to play in advocating to governments for contributing resources and funding into manufacturing and to resource development. I think we've got a role to play in advocating for in what we do in terms of the relevant makeup of fossil fuels versus non-fossil fuels. So all of these things, I think psychologists can help because they can provide good evidence-based research to feed into the debate. The other thing that I did want to say is I do think that psychology's got an amazing role to play in helping to debunk misinformation. So there are wonderful cognitive psychologists who have developed wonderful tools to help people to provide information to people who may be swayed by misinformation and disinformation, people who might be vulnerable to conspiracy theories. I think psychology's got a lot to play in developing theories and empirical work to redress those things. So I think that the key message would be to make a plan in advance. Have a plan in mind about what you might do in the event of a flash flood, in the instance of Indonesia, for example, and in Australia, in the event of fires. Have a plan in mind. What will you do? Where will you go? How will you take your pets? Where will you take what will you take with you? What important photographs will you take with you? What important documents? Have in mind how you will get out of the situation, because once it's too late, it's too difficult to make those plans. Yeah, thank you for a great interview. I think we've covered a lot of information. I think the other thing too is that psychologists can really help people deal with the emotional reactions. The feelings of despair, the feelings of hopelessness. I think they can also give really excellent, they can provide skills in not just how to regulate emotions, but also to help people to understand the physiological response and help people to do really simple things to manage the physiological response, such as breathing calmly, to recognise what panic looks like, and simple things that they can potentially incorporate, not just when there's an extreme weather event, but in everyday life when people are impacted by threats. Yeah, so I think psychology's got an amazing role to play across the board.
Lead and innovate.